Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm doing the bookish part of the wrap-up for February. And I've got a lovely stack of books here that I either read, one I didn't finish, might finish later, one I thought I would finish last month and finished this month, and then one that I'm still working on. So there's a bit of a stack there. The first book I want to talk about was actually my favorite, and that was Edward Said's Orientalism. This had been on my list of books to read for years. It's a classic, and it's a classic for a lot of very good reasons. It's a very academic book, so if that's not your thing, you might not like it. It's not like a sort of popular sociology book. It is, the language is academic, it's very precise, but I appreciate that. And I don't find that he used academic language just to use academic language. I think he chose his words really purposefully. And this was a book that I've read. So I've read a lot of books about the Middle East, like histories in the Middle East, usually by Westerners, because it's hard to find histories by Middle Eastern authors in English, which is one of the reasons I'm trying to learn Arabic. Which is a long process. But I'd wanted to read this book because there are some ways of viewing the Middle East that just are strange. They rely a lot on stereotypes that are not true now, and for the most part have never been true of most people. So, like, when I first started reading books about the Middle East was in the lead up to the war in Iraq. And the way Iraqis were discussed on the news was like they weren't really three-dimensional people. They were Americans' ideas of what Iraqis might be like. Theoretically, had any of these people who are talking about Iraq ever met an Iraqi, it seemed doubtful because they weren't talking about actual human beings or one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. And so this was a really interesting book to read for sort of related reasons. Said was Palestinian, and most of this book is set in the Levant area. So, not set in, but discusses the Levant area primarily. So Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Just because it's impossible to talk about all of Asia in a book this size, you'd need like 37 books this size to even give you an overview on all of Asia. And this really isn't about Asia so much. He describes his thoughts, or rather he describes what he's trying to do in this book as discussing Europe's collective daydream about the Orient, which is really what this book is about. And so it's not about who people in the Middle East actually are, it's about how Westerners have perceived people in the Middle East and how that hasn't changed as much as it should have, and how that doesn't tend to reflect the reality of people in the Middle East. So it's really very interesting. He used the term imaginative geography at one point, and it really, throughout this book, the different authors he discusses, I mean, they range from fiction authors and poets to nonfiction, self-described experts on what at the time was called the Near East, in relation to Europe. And it's really interesting because you realize just how much of probably even current Middle Eastern studies has its roots in what Europeans thought about people based on very few facts, generalized extremely widely. And yeah, it's just not a solid foundation on which to describe an entire group of extremely diverse people. So this was a really good book, and it's because it's quite academic. It really will like stretch your brain out a little bit, which is nice. I enjoy that. Not every book I read, but a lot of them. It's nice. It's nice to be sort of to be intellectually challenged in that way. So yeah, this was a really good one. There's the back. Yeah, it's a classic for a reason, and I've got the audiobook for Culture and Imperialism, which is sort of his follow-up to this one. So I'm really looking forward to reading that one. The next 2 books I'm going to talk about are ones that were kind of disappointing in comparison. They're very popular on Goodreads. A lot of people like them. But after Orientalism, which was so exceptional, these ones just felt a bit meh. So one of them is Salt, A World History. And I'd read A History of Nonviolence by Mark Kurlansky and really liked it. This one, though, I don't know. It wasn't bad. It's just that it got really dull for, like, the middle third. I don't know. It just didn't do it for me. And I like food. I've read different sort of books about food. I've read a book about the history of tea, which is really interesting and really quite violent. And in some ways, this is quite violent, too. There are certainly violent moments in the history of salt and salt trade around the world. So there were parts that were interesting. But I don't know. Maybe I should have not read it right after Orientalism, because it just didn't seem as interesting. And then the other book was David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. And I'd read, I can't remember what, by Gladwell before, and kind of enjoyed it. And this was kind of the same. Like, it's entertaining stories, but Orientalism is so intellectually rigorous, and this is so not. Some of the arguments in here are a bit uninspiring. A lot of the sources are anecdotal. It's just like, I don't know. Reading his arguments in this book after reading Orientalism was like, I mean, I guess that could be true, but I was not convinced by most of the arguments. I expected maybe something a bit more thorough. And this just wasn't that. So yeah, I don't know. I wasn't convinced by some of the claims in here. I think that some of them were a bit too flimsy. But the stories were entertaining. Like, it was a fun book to read, so knock yourself out, I guess. The next book I read was quite good. It is... actually, there were 2 books, so I don't have the physical book for Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz, Fanon. That's a book that I read after reading these other 2 because I wanted something more intellectually stimulating. Just more well thought through. And it was that. It's a classic of Caribbean decolonial literature, and I think there are good reasons for that. It was interesting to read because I haven't read a lot of Caribbean anything, history, fiction, anything. Like, I've read bits and pieces, but not enough to actually know what I'm talking about the Caribbean. So there were a lot of cases where I was like, not entirely sure I was convinced by his arguments, but also I am, as a white Canadian woman, not in a position to argue with him. Like, I can't say, no, that's not what happens. I have no idea. So, I just sort of had to take his word for it sometimes, which, okay. But it was very interesting. It was about people's experiences in the Caribbean and in Europe mostly, and mostly Black people, or people with really darker skin who are, taken to be Black in Europe. It was interesting. It was not sort of the perspective I'd ever read before, which I always appreciate, reading new to me perspectives. One thing I will say is it's really about Black men. He very rarely talks about women's experiences. So I don't know how those are different. I assume they're different in some ways, but I don't know. But yeah, it was interesting. And then the next one I read was Jews, God, and History by Max I. Dimont. I think it was actually finished by his daughter or some relative, because I think he passed away before it was quite finished. But it's an interesting book of sort of Jewish history, but more like an intellectual history of Jewish people. It's like, it's not there's a little bit of, first the people started here, then they moved there, then this historical event happened. There's a little bit of that, but mostly just for context. There's more intellectual and cultural history. One of his arguments is that the Jewish people have contributed quite a lot to European culture that goes unacknowledged, which, seems plausible. I'm not going to argue with him on that one. One thing I would have liked is more discussions about the cultural history of Jewish people from like the Middle East, North Africa, places other than Europe. He did mostly focus on Europe and then a little bit the US. But it was pretty interesting. It's, I mean, with the whole Israel and Palestine catastrophe at the moment, there is anti-Semitism on the rise. And, you know, I'm generally in favor of Palestinians having, totally in favor of Palestinians having equal rights and freedoms to Israelis. But yeah, it's strange online these days. There are a lot of anti-Semitism is on the rise. There are very strange comments of people who seem to have bought into some anti-Semitic stereotypes, which is unfortunate because that's not going to help anybody. I don't even think that's going to help the Palestinians in the long run. I think it's bad for everybody. But so it's interesting to read this book. I don't know, the conspiracy theorists would probably have fun with this because he does talk about the ways in which Jewish people, like noteworthy Jewish people, like Freud and Einstein and others, have impacted Western culture. But yeah, it's interesting. I always think it's interesting to learn about other cultures and other religions, and so he does talk a little bit about religious history in here as well as intellectual history, and of course there's a lot of overlap between the two. So yeah, it was pretty cool. I'm glad I read it. I'm not sure I'd ever read it again, but it was interesting. Oh yeah, Ethel Dimont was the person who I think finished it for him. Dimont? Not sure. I can't remember how to say that name. The book that I'm working on right now is A Piece to End All Peace by David Fromkin. This is also a book that's been on my shelf for a million years. It starts, as the subtitle says, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern Middle East. It is basically a history of colonialism in the Middle East. And my God, did the British do a lot of damage. I haven't gotten to the parts where the Americans do a lot of damage. That's coming. The Russians have done their share of damage too, but I mean, it's horrifying how the entitlement of certain Western countries to think they know better. I mean, first of all, they'd sell some of their ideas as, you know, this is good for you, you're going to have freedom in, like, let's say Jordan. Or Saudi Arabia or whatever, you know, will help you develop, etc., etc. It's really paternalistic, but it's also really deceptive, because even when they purported to look out for Arab interests, they really didn't in any way. Like, it was, I mean, maybe the odd person did, but for the most part, no. The politicians were interested in British interests, which should surprise exactly nobody, but if you haven't interacted with a country before and you don't know that you're supposed to be cynical, haven't spoken to India at this point, I suppose, you can be deceived by their promises. And people were. And it got ugly, and it's still ugly. Like, it's still, a lot of the mess that exists currently in the Middle East can be traced back to, among others, the British, because of course it can. They really do bear a lot of responsibility for the current state of affairs. So do the Americans. But that's not the part that I've gotten to in this book, so maybe I'll talk about that more next month, if I'm done by then. One of the books that I didn't finish this month, and won't finish, at least at the moment, is Middlemarch by George Eliot. This has been on my shelf for a while. I really liked The Mill on the Floss. Is that what it's called? And now suddenly I'm doubting. Anyway, that book, loved it. This one I liked, but about halfway through I was like, I'm not really paying attention anymore. I'm not into it. I'll just put it on pause to get back on my shelf. Come back to it, I don't know, some months or maybe years from now when I feel like it. I do like this cover though. It's quite fun. And then this is the book that I finished, that I thought I would finish by the end of last month, or like by the first of the month or something, and then just didn't, because I got sidetracked. But this is by an author from Eswatini, which used to be called Swaziland, and it's set in apartheid South Africa in the 50s, which is really interesting because, you know, I've read Mandela's A Long Walk to Freedom, which is also fascinating. Highly recommend it. But it's interesting to read fiction because then you sort of get to experience that world in your own head for a minute. You know, like you don't actually live those experiences, but you get more of a feel for what people went through. Plus, it's just a good murder mystery, which is fun. And I like cozy mysteries and some types of like Nordic noir type murder mysteries, those sorts of things. To like in between all of the nonfiction that I read, they're like good brain relaxing sort of books. And I am looking out for ones from like more international, more outside of Europe and North America. So that was fun. And then the last book that I'll just mention is, I've got a few of these readers. They're Modern Standard Arabic and English. And I suck at Arabic. Like, I'm not going to pretend I'm even passingly close to fluent because I'm a very far thing from it. But these are fun to read. I'm at the point where if I'm listening to it and reading the English at the same time, I can follow the story, obviously, because I'm reading the English, which is sort of like watching a TV show in another language with English subtitles. If I'm reading Arabic, first of all, I miss a few words because I'm not very fast at reading Arabic because some of the letters have just such different sounds that I'm a bit slow. But it's good practice, but I'm at the point where, despite that, like I can't completely follow the story. I know the story now because I've read it a few times. But if I'm listening to an Arabic, I can pick out I know that word, like, you know, that sort of thing as I go. So yeah, it's an interesting experience. I'm enjoying it. I'm not one for like grammar drills and textbooks and that sort of thing. That's boring and I won't do it, really. Like, I have a couple Assamil books, mostly just for curiosity. Like, if I think I notice a pattern, then I can look things up and go, that's interesting. But I don't tend to use grammar books for anything other than just passing curiosity every now and again. But these are really fun. I'm enjoying them. And that's the list of books I read this month, or am reading. And yeah, not quite as bananas as last month. A more reasonable number of books to read in a month, at least for me, not for everybody. But I do tend to read a lot. Oh, and more of the puzzle is done now. So I have a tree and some, I don't know, is that a wheat field? It's Van Gogh. I don't know. But I'm enjoying that too. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.